Hey Sarah, how are you?
Hi, Aaron. I'm doing great.
Great, nice to see you.
Yeah, great to see you as well.
Let's talk recruiting.
Let's do it.
Okay. So starting just let's rewind just a little. I want to talk about you. We'll get into the recruiting as a whole, but what draws someone like yourself into the field of recruiting?
Yeah, to be perfectly honest with you, I originally just kind of like fell into it. And the thing that's kept me there over all of these years is really just like the people that I've worked with. I've worked at a variety of companies like early stage startups, scale ups, and I've just been so impressed by the different kinds of people I've worked with, whether it's been, technical product folks or marketers. I've just been passionate about helping them to be successful in their jobs, like working with hiring managers to build out their teams. And it's just been fun to see people be successful in their careers and build out like really meaningful teams that have a big impact on things.
Yeah, it's just, I mean, you mentioned like the passion behind it and maybe championing others. Is there beyond yourself, are there certain skill sets or personality traits that tend to make for good recruiters in general?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things. One is I've found that really successful recruiters are empathetic. So they take the time to understand like what is the kind of acute problem? Like, why are we making this hire? And like, why does this hiring manager like passionate about getting this role filled? And then on the flip side of that, really understanding like why candidates are open to new opportunities, like what is really going to be a good fit, and then being able to kind of like pair those two parties together and say like I genuinely believe that this is going to be like a good long-term match. And again, I think it goes back to the empathy, like just being able to kind of understand and get to the root of like what's going on with these different individuals. I think the other part is just being a good active listener is like another part of that, is just being able to really like hear what's going on, and also not be afraid to ask questions like, okay, you said this is a challenge, but I'm hearing something else here. Like, what is really going on? Because I think when a recruiter can kind of like push a little bit and kind of challenge what's being said or just kind of dig and uncover things, that's where they can help people to make like thoughtful decisions and make the good long-term decisions. So I found that that's really important as well.
Yeah, and I think a part of your approach is making that connection between the candidate and the recruiter and making a genuine human connection too.
That's right.
Right? And a lot of candidates must think when they're reaching out to recruiters or trying to make that connection that all recruiters are the same. But I
Mm.
presume there can be a big variation in the types of recruiters, or some are in-house, or some work for a firm like TalentStarter where you're at.
Yeah,
Um,
that's right.
and some do more managing postings, and some do more direct sourcing. Can you explain some of the different types of recruiters and the roles that they play?
Yeah, I'd say like there are two major buckets that recruiters fall into. So you have your in-house recruiters, and in-house recruiters like work for a specific company. So, for example, in the past, I've worked at places like Zapier or HubSpot, and I was working in-house. I was, working with, let's say, a marketing team. And so I'd have kind of a list of jobs that we were trying to fill for that marketing team at that specific company. But then you also have your agency recruiters. Recruiters are maybe working with a variety of companies on a variety of jobs. It's really interesting because I think like in-house recruiters have a really good perspective on like that specific company because they're entrenched in that company. They know what's going on. They've got a really good feel for the culture and the vibe and the team. So that's one way to look at it. I think for agency recruiters, they can also get that, a sense of the team and the company. But I think they also have a really unique perspective on the market because they're working with so many companies, they're working with a variety of candidates. I think they've got like a really good finger on the pulse as far as like different trends and how to help candidates set themselves apart. So different types of recruiters just kind of have different perspective on things. I found in this market in particular where things are like really competitive and you might, whereas in the past you might have had 20 people applying for a job, now you have over 200 people applying for a job. I think agency recruiters have a really good handle on how to help candidates get that like competitive edge right now.
Hmm. Maybe a broader perspective than sitting inside
Exactly.
the company.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's yeah.
yeah, and you've done both. So are there other pitfalls or maybe limitations of a company managing their own recruiting internally without seeking help externally?
Yeah, I mean, there's no shortage of challenges in recruiting. I think oftentimes like a company will come to, let's say, TalentStarter, for example, or an agency recruitment, because one of the challenges that they're running into is maybe they don't have as much clarity, or maybe the market is a little bit more volatile, and so they're not necessarily ready to build out a recruitment function, or maybe they don't want to commit to bringing more recruiters in-house, but they still have that need. They still have like a meaningful hiring plan. So a company like that would turn to us to say like, hey, we actually need to bring on a team of, let's say, 5 recruiters, because we have this hiring plan that we're up against. And so that's where TalentStarter would come in. We'd be able to plug in a bunch of recruiters who are working to help the business be successful. So that's why they turn to us. I'd say another one is that companies have like an acute problem. So maybe, because of layoffs, I've seen a lot of companies have had to lay off recruiters who might be more specialized. And so they might lose that specialization. So they might turn to TalentStarter to say, like, hey, we're really struggling on these types of positions in particular. And like, we need your expertise to help us with those like difficult engineering roles or those difficult marketing roles. And they kind of lean on us to be that expertise or that specialization for them in the market. So those are kind of big things that are coming up for us. And then I'd say the other one too is that you have maybe your early stage startups that haven't built out that recruitment function. They don't even know where to begin. And so they turn to us to say like, hey, we need you to advise while also helping us to go out into the market and attract talent so we can scale the company.
Yeah, and you have your own specializations within recruitment. It's not. I mean, you could potentially do everything and anything, but you have your core specializations and types of companies that you lock on with.
Yeah, that's definitely the case. I mean, I think the sweet spot for us has really been like those SaaS like tech companies, right? And then there's certainly a lot of buckets even within that context, but that's kind of been the sweet spot for us. We've also worked in consumer goods. That's been like another spot that's been good for us. But yeah, I think it's been kind of a variety of settings where ultimately, if a business is looking for expertise in the technical side of things, so engineering and product, or then they need help or support on the go-to-market front. So, your marketing, your sales, that's really where they turn to TalentStarter to help them out.
Hmm. Yeah, and I know you branched out beyond tech, but you do have that core specialization within tech as well, with a number of tech companies. I'm wondering, do you find across one to another, are you finding common motivations in terms of hiring practices or the wish lists? Are there some general principles that cross over from one company to the next?
Yeah, I think the companies that we kind of like choose to work with, they're a good fit for us, we're a good fit for them, really care about that candidate experience, right? I think along the way, I was saying like, hey, empathy is really kind of at the core of it all. I think recruiters end up being an extension of a brand. And so when we talk with our clients, they say like, we want someone who really understands that like without the people, we're nothing. And so we want to make sure that when we have recruiters going out into the market, that our candidates are really being interacted with in a way that like really kind of shows what we care about and that we care about the talent that we're bringing into our organization. So I'd say that that's like a really big part of it, is making sure that there's that like values alignment for how communication is taking place. And then I'd say that another part of it is making sure that like that expertise is truly there. It's one thing to say we need an engineer. It's another thing to really kind of dig into the weeds and make sure that you have a recruiting partner who understands the different technologies that are being used and why they're being used, and kind of like being able to tell that story so people understand, well, the recruiters actually understand these are the type of engineers that we're going after and where we can find like that pocket of talent. I think that's another part of it as well.
Yeah, well, and that leads to more, I guess, curated recommendations or deeper connections. But building connections takes time and effort. Where would you say where do you devote most of your time? What does your typical day look like if there's a typical day? Yeah.
Well, the one thing I've learned in recruiting is that there's no typical day. But what I will say is that it really comes down to like having those conversations. I think early on in my recruiting career, I realized that like it's one thing to sit at a computer, it's another thing to always be like interacting and whether it's taking part in like a dialogue that's happening, or whether that's like part of a Slack channel or that is kind of like a networking event. I think that that's like such a big part of recruiting is like getting out there, talking with people. My partner the other day was saying, I was on a plane and I just picked up a conversation with someone and it turned out that they had some hiring needs. So I think just it's putting yourself out there, it's having conversations, it's not being afraid to step outside of your comfort zone. It's also calling upon your network. I think that all goes into it. At the end of the day, like we are dealing with humans, so it's all about those interactions that happen.
Well, and you mentioned the 200 applicants type of scenario before, which I think we've all seen in this market is a great opportunity, great, position goes up, and then there's a beeline to it, and there's hundreds.
Right.
And if you're trying to build, those human connections or get through on it, how, in general, how many candidates can you actually evaluate for any given position?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer to that is like it is endless, but I think on the other hand of that is like you want to be thoughtful about kind of the evaluation. Excuse me. So a big thing is like early on establishing what is going to be a good fit for this role. So I was talking about like that values alignment when we're working with companies. It's so important to sit down and take the time to say like, okay, we've got this job. We could hire any number of people, but like, how will we ultimately know it's the right fit for us? And I think on one hand, you can have a job listing, a job description that has a long laundry list of things. Or you could say, hey, let's make a really specific job description so people can opt in or opt out.
Um, yeah, with the sheer number of candidates for any position, we're talking about that building that human connection. Um, and I wonder, it can feel dehumanizing in a way when you look at something that's got hundreds of applicants and you know that maybe you're just another number on the candidate side or on the recruiter side. It's just the sheer number of people that have been vulnerable in some kind of way and
Right.
put their expertise onto into a document and said, here, give me merit, right? Or don't.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you keep that human connection going in that type of scenario?
Yeah, I mean, listen, it's tough on all sides, right? Like this market is it's a wild market. And so I think like the human element is, especially when it comes to recruiting, is giving people clarity. So for example, like I always think about if someone has clicked the button like submit resume, that's like a true act of bravery to do that. Like someone's put themselves out there by taking that step. And so what I think that comes down to is like at different layers of the interview process, like we all owe it to each other to have that like two-way street, right? So if someone at that first stage has submitted their application, like I feel like this should be just a common thing that we send a note to say like, thank you for taking the time to submit your resume, and then creating that clarity of like whether or not that person's going to be moving forward in the process. It's a really simple thing, but I think just companies committing to saying like, hey, if you've taken the time to submit your resume to us, we're going to let you know where you stand in the process. Like that is like the ultimate act of just being, humanizing that process so people know like, okay, the loop has been closed. I know what to expect. And I always think about like at each stage along that journey, people have made more of a like commitment to the company, to the hiring manager, to the recruiter. And so I think like it gets deeper, right? Like if for someone who's made it to later stages of the interview process, I always think it's important to provide like feedback, right? Hey, you've taken the time to go through these different rounds of the interview process. Like, here's the main reason why we've decided to move forward with your candidacy, or like, hey, here's a main reason why ultimately we've decided this isn't a good fit on both ends. I think that that's so important, and that like feedback loop is really what gives us all kind of humanity in that process. And then I think the other thing is like everyone just kind of committing to receiving the feedback, whether it's the recruiter receiving feedback from the candidate or vice versa, just committing to receiving that feedback with humility and delivering it with humility as well, I think is just like an important part of it. But
That
even if
feedback,
yeah, feedback, it's so important. And, I think
valuable.
exactly. When I worked at HubSpot, one of the phrases that we always said is like feedback is kind of the breakfast of champions, right? Like just being able to deliver it and receive it is such an important act. And so it's just kind of been ingrained in me that that's an important thing. And certainly there are times where, we're not able to deliver that or share that. But I think just being honest and closing that loop, if nothing else, is such an important part of it.
Yeah, well, that's what I've been hearing is, from others, I wish they would tell me, not that I can change my experience or change, my DNA. But I could learn from that and adjust the type of opportunity I'm going after, or pick up, skill up on a specific area if I only knew. And a lot of times it seems like a vacuum.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I always think about the skill up piece where it's like, if you can share that feedback, then someone can make different decisions about, okay, this is what I should be raising my hand for, when I do land in my next opportunity, or just giving people some more like insight for, okay, here are ways that I can round out my experience. Or some of you might say, I'm not interested in skilling up in that area, and that's okay too. And they're better for it, knowing that like, okay, well, that's not the path I wanted to go down. So I can see, why that opportunity wasn't the best fit ultimately.
Yeah, well, and I would think that direct and kind feedback, but that gets to the point, and this points out specifically, adjustments that are within that candidate's control and can be made, is where the favor comes in, as opposed to saying, it just came down to you and another candidate, and it just didn't go your way. The vagueness of it can, I imagine, can be extremely agitating versus
Yeah,
just, maybe it's like ripping a Band-Aid. You hear the news, but to with a specific degree what happened, right?
right,
That's
exactly.
power.
Exactly. And like, let's be honest, giving and receiving feedback, it's not always an easy practice, right? Like I always think about that it's kind of like a muscle that you build. But I think in time, if you kind of practice both the receiving and the delivering, that it can be done like in a really good, like productive, healthy way. So yeah.
But then there's also, I've been hearing about this growing practice of what I call it like the letdown meeting, where on
Mm.
the candidate side, it seems like that final conversation, maybe there's some pre-negotiation happening, about to happen. But then the outcome of that call is the news that, hey, it didn't fall your way. That I want to tell you what happened. But it's perceived from the candidate side like we're about to, sign some documents. I want to
Mm.
know what you thought about that approach.
Yeah, I'm just going to clarify because I want to make sure I'm understanding like what you're sharing the right way. But it sounds like maybe there's like that a meeting that people have kind of in their minds, but the candidate maybe thinks that they're going to receive something different from the recruiter who's delivering the news. Is that what you're
Yeah.
saying?
So I've been hearing about the first runner-up candidate, maybe whoever
Okay, gotcha.
next in line, um,
Mm-hmm.
gets the, hey, can we chat for a few minutes? And it seems like it's closing in on, we have to work out a couple final things, or there's a salary adjustment, or whatever the final boxes to check. But the motivation and outcome of that conversation is that direct feedback that this wasn't for you.
I
Um,
see. I see.
but for all
Yeah.
intents and purposes, on the candidate side, it's presented, or it's perceived that it's the final call with good news.
I say, okay. So it sounds like what you're saying is like there are times when candidates are made it to a final stage and are expecting like a positive outcome, the positive outcome being like, hey, you've gotten the job,
Right.
but then they go into the meeting and a different like news is ultimately delivered to them. It's, hey, we've decided to go in a different direction or move forward with a different candidate. I always, okay, so here's something that I always think about or try and practice is in the beginning of working with a candidate. And I think this goes back to the empathy piece, asking the question of like, how do you like to receive feedback? Because I think like we've probably all experienced this before. It's one thing to receive feedback that you've opted into or get information in a way that you've opted to receive it, but it's another thing to all of a sudden have it dropped in your lap when you're not expecting it or you're receiving it in a different way than was expected.
Hmm.
And so what I've seen recruiters do like a really good job of is I've worked with recruiters who say to candidates like, hey, listen, before we get started here, this is the beginning of an interview process. They'll say, how do you prefer to receive feedback? Or if we do get to a point where, ultimately we're not going to be moving forward with your candidacy, like how would you like to receive that type of information? And I found that that's like a really great way for everyone to like calibrate and get on the same page. And then also kind of like as you're interacting with each other, you kind of know what you're going to be receiving and how you'll be receiving that. That's not to say that, you couldn't at some point be caught off guard or something that might not catch you off guard. But I think there is like that kind of nuance to getting aligned with both the candidate and the recruiter getting aligned to how are we going to communicate like throughout this process. um, I think that kind of starts to speak to someone not being caught off guard by news or like
Yeah,
getting news that they weren't expecting to get. Yeah, I think it's just kind of creating that two-way street.
that's a nice tone for the working relationship. And I don't think I've ever been asked that in a business environment. It's a generous way of approaching it.
Yeah, I mean, I've had, there's certainly threads on like Reddit, for example, where people say, hey, I'm really frustrated. A recruiter gave me a call and shared this news, or hey, I'm really frustrated the recruiter didn't give me a call. And I think what that all boils down to is everyone has a different way that they like to receive information. And, if we can just ask that question of like, hey, how would you like me to let you know if this happens? That just kind of creates kind of a common ground where people can receive information in the best way.
Hmm. I like that a lot.
Yeah.
So, and the candidates that you put forward aren't always the candidates the company aligns with, right? That happens. The ones.
Yeah, so if by that you mean, well, actually, let me ask you, what are
Sure.
you trying to figure out there? I want to make sure I'm answering this
Okay,
question.
so I'm wondering if, a company comes up with eventually a definition around a job posting or what the role entails. And sometimes there are candidates that come through that have potential, maybe would be
Mm,
key assets to the organization that they're being put in front of. But it's not a straight shot for what's being asked for.
okay, gotcha.
And if you have made that connection with the candidate, see their value to the organization, I'm wondering what happens in those types of scenarios.
Yeah, I mean, there's always going to be a scenario where, the candidate doesn't actually check every single box. That's the case whether you're an in-house recruiter or you're an agency recruiter. And I think at the end of the day, like where I've seen people break through there is one, you have that tight alignment between the recruiter and the candidate. So like both parties have taken the time to understand like what is kind of the impact that this person has had on an organization? Like, what have they been able to accomplish? Because when a candidate really takes the time to build that connection with the recruiter like becomes your advocate, right? Like they're the one who's kind of going to bat and like telling that story about here's why this candidate looks a little bit different on paper than what we've discussed, but like why you should be picking up the phone and or hopping on Zoom and having a conversation with this candidate. So I think that tight alignment between the candidate and the recruiter, just having that good working dialogue is really important. I think the other thing is I always think about how important it is as a recruiter to like help give candidates the language that they need to help people to understand what they've done, why they're kind of like a solution for the problem that a company is happening, because ultimately like a company goes to hire because they have a problem that they're facing and they're hoping that that person can come in and solve it. And so I think when recruiters are able to kind of equip candidates with the language that they need to position themselves as a solution to that problem that the company is facing, that's where the recruiter is then equipped with the understanding that they need to know if they should go to bat for that candidate and say like, hey, again, this person doesn't look like an exact match, but here's why you should be having that conversation. And then it also helps the candidate to figure out like, okay, yes, this is an opportunity where I want you to go to bat for me because I know that I'm capable of, taking on that challenge and kind of knocking it out of the park. I always think about there's a technique called the STAR interview technique. It stands for situation, task, action, and result. I found that that technique in particular is where it gives candidates like the framework to help people to really understand like what they've done, what they're capable of, and how they overcome different challenges. So I always work with my candidates to help them understand like, hey, here's the technique that we can really use to get aligned here, and also to help you with any interview process that you're a part of.
Wow. And we've been talking about positions or opportunities that are already identified. If
Mhm.
but what if a candidate gets on your radar, but there's no, so they have your attention, but there's no immediate need for their skill set? What are some of the things that they can do to stay top of mind that are appreciated?
Yeah, I always think about like how we were talking about this a little bit before, but the importance of like that relationship building, like all of this comes down to those human connections. And I think like, this market is a perfect example of all of a sudden maybe candidates are picking up their heads in a different way than they have before and saying like, I should be, networking with recruiters.
Mhm.
That's why I always think about how important it is to always kind of have your head up, even in the best market. Like it's so important to talk with recruiters because they just have a really good feel for the market. Even if you're not actively looking for a job, it's always helpful to talk to a recruiter. You can learn the insight about like, okay, what are other professionals like me making in the market right now? Like, am I being paid competitively? You can take the time to understand like, okay, what kind of opportunities are you seeing being presented at this point. And I think as a candidate, if you're always kind of, even let's say it's like on a yearly basis, just touching base with recruiters or responding to the notes that they send, that's a really great way to just kind of be a familiar face, be a familiar presence. Because you never know when a recruiter might land on an opportunity that could be a fantastic match for you. And if that person has been interacting with you, year after year, whatever the cadence is, they're more likely to say, Aaron is the perfect person. We've been talking all of these years, and I know this is going to be the right role. So I just think it's so important to just kind of have those ongoing like dialogues and conversations so you can remain on the top of mind with folks. Because it's a lot different to all of a sudden say, like, I've had all these recruiters reaching out to me and I've never once responded, and now I really need their help. That's not to say that they wouldn't be there to help you or they wouldn't be wanting to talk. But you're just coming at it from a totally different direction than someone who's, kind of nurtured those relationships over time.
You're just a name, and you're up for new evaluation. You haven't built up the credibility, you haven't built up the dynamic, and that the shared
It,
history.
exactly. Yeah, you're having to establish that rapport as opposed to just kind
Yeah,
of building off
rapport.
a pre-existing rapport.
So on the flip side, what are some of the things that historically don't work that prospective candidates keep doing? Maybe pet peeves on your side, or just mistakes that, in trying to get the attention of a recruiter like you, or in the interactions that maybe, a potential candidate keeps doing and doesn't realize this isn't being perceived well.
That's a good question. I'm trying to like wrap my brain. I think I've been lucky enough to just like work with really wonderful people. But I think if anything, sometimes what we find agency recruiters perhaps is that people sometimes apply for jobs and then they say, "Hey, Sarah, like, can you help me out with this job?" Which if they've already applied, sometimes that can be a little bit more difficult. But I think it's really important if you're thinking about working with an agency recruiter to reach out to that recruiter first and say like, hey, here's what I'm thinking about, and kind of align on that search so the recruiter can help you Instead of, just submitting your resume to the ether, they're saying, okay, great. Like, here are the leaders that I'm working with. Here are the companies I'm working with. Like, I'd love to make that direct connection to those individuals. Or also, I think recruiters are generally pretty honest about like, hey, actually, I'm not going to be the best resource for you for this opportunity, and then getting out of the way so that you can go ahead and apply for things directly. But I think it's so important to, align with recruiters, align with resources to get that like extra boost, get that extra help when you're thinking about your search.
So if a job seeker follows those recommendations and they feel like maybe there's a recruiter in their corner, but the timing just hasn't hit yet, and they're starting to hit their head against the wall, like they've tried
Mm.
everything.
Yep.
What haven't they tried yet that maybe could give them an edge or the boost that they need?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of similar to recruiters, right? Like I was saying, like, sometimes you bump into people or you start having these conversations that turn into something where maybe that wasn't like the original intention. I was saying, like, my partner was on a plane and all of a sudden it turned into a conversation about hiring. I think, you know, my heart just goes out to people who have been applying to, let's say, like hundreds of jobs, right? And like how overwhelming, how frustrating would that be to keep doing that exercise over and over again? But I think maybe just getting like creative about like, okay, maybe it isn't just applying to jobs that will ultimately like lead me to a job. So maybe it's asking for advice, or maybe it's, getting involved with tangentially related projects. Like, I think there are so many different routes that you can take that will still kind of lead to a similar outcome. And I think sometimes when we get like more creative or we try like a different approach, that's ultimately what helps us to break through. So I think that's like an important part of it as well. And then I think it also just helps from like a sanity standpoint as well, right? To be able to say like, okay, I'm doing something different. I'm giving things another try because, you know, you could go volunteer somewhere and you never know, that volunteer standing next to you could be, another marketer, and all of a sudden you have this really interesting conversation and it leads to something else. So I think like that's an important part of it as well.
Yeah. And that's what I tell people too, is just start doing, maybe it's an indirect way to get to the point that you're looking for, but
Right.
maybe what you thought you were looking for isn't what you actually would be happy with and be fulfilled by.
Right.
You
Yeah.
start that journey.
That's exactly it. I mean, I never thought I would get into recruiting, and I kind of fell into it. And it all started with I had spoken with a family friend who said, listen, when you're first starting in your career, a great place to start is sales. And I started applying for a lot of sales jobs and I didn't get any bites. And then I was like, okay, well, what's like another form of sales? Recruiting in a way is kind of, similar.
Yeah,
So I started applying for recruiting jobs, and all of a sudden I started getting all of these bites. And that's how I, got my first foray into recruitment. So I think sometimes it's just coming at things from like a different angle can kind of be that breakthrough moment where you're able to, make things really happen.
absolutely. And I would think from the recruiting side, you can see from a candidate if they've leaned into their interests and done the volunteer aspect or generated some type of momentum around themselves. You can tell that from the outside, as opposed to maybe a candidate that's doing the rinse and repeat, apply. um, does it present differently?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think like whenever there's passion in what someone's doing, like that definitely stands out. And I think when you're able to just kind of like focus on what your passion is, then, for example, as opposed to standing out hundreds of resumes, maybe you do take a more targeted approach. But then in doing that, you're able to put like more thought into your resume or your cover letter or the interview process. So I think that's so important, is really just kind of honing in on, okay, this is where I feel like I have a good shot. And so like that's where I'm going to really like focus my time and my energy. And I'm a true believer in like quality over quantity. I've just found that that's kind of been the thing. And I think that it also applies to the interview process and applying for opportunities.
Yeah, so maybe apply to 5 and give it your all, as opposed to 500 and hope
Yeah,
for the best.
exactly. Yeah, I think that's it.
All right, I got one more for you. because over the course of your own career, you've no doubt been on both sides of both seats,
Sure.
right? You've been a candidate yourself,
Hmm.
what that experience is like, and you have empathy for those on the other side.
Right.
I'm wondering what's the most unexpected question you've ever been asked as a candidate?
Oh, like when I'm going, like interviewing for a job, what's the most unexpected thing? Is that what you're
Yeah,
saying?
throughout your work history, then
Oh, hmm. I have to think about that one a little bit.
yeah.
It's I haven't been thrown off too much. Um, Give me a moment here. Huh. I don't know. I haven't been thrown off. I think I might be an over preparer. When I'm interviewing, I get really in my head because like you said, I've been on both sides of things. So I always like to write down like, okay, what are some of the kind of the interview questions that I can expect and like what might catch me off guard and just kind of like run through things. But I don't know that there's really been something that's totally thrown me for a loop.
Mm,
I haven't come across that yet. That's not to say it won't happen. You never know, right?
sure. Yeah, I was in the process with a Silicon Valley company years ago, and pretty new early career, and they asked me something about the number of telephone poles in Canada as
Oh, okay.
maybe a logic exercise, but they clearly got it from some book, and it had nothing to do with anything else that we were there to talk about. So I was
Yeah.
just curious if you had one of those, and
I've definitely worked with folks who have come to me and said, "Should I ask a question like that?" Um, I always say no. I think at the end of the day, like it kind of goes back to the empathy of like, let's ask the questions that ultimately are going to help us to understand whether or not someone's like truly a good fit for the role. But yeah, no, I haven't been thrown for for a loop like that.
all right, good for you.
Yeah.
Sarah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Aaron. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Absolutely, this is great. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Have a good one.
You too.
Okay.